Okay, so hi Ty, and welcome to our webinar, Okinawan Diaspora, Trials and Triumphs. This is one of the webinars that we're presenting in a series this year. This follows our Okinawan Studies webinar that we did with the OPG DC Office and the Okinawa Collection here at George Washington University back in December. This is the second webinar, and there will be a third one at the end of March. My name is Kristen Luck, and I'm the librarian for the Okinawa Collection and Japan Resource Center here at George Washington University, and I will be the moderator for our event this evening. Before we introduce our panelist, I would like to welcome Mr. Kazuyuki Nakasato from the Okinawa Prefectural DC Office to make some opening remarks for us. Thank you very much, Mr. Nakasato.
Haisai usuyo chu ganabira. Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending where you are. My name is Kazuyuki Nakasato. I'm very pleased to be here today. First, please let me briefly introduce our office. I'm the director of Okinawa Prefecture DC Office, the local office in the Okinawan Prefectural government. Our office was established in 2015. The primary focus of our work is finding creative solutions to address issues in Okinawa today, including the military-based issues. However, another important aspect of our mission is to conveying accurate information about Okinawa to the American people. We cherish each and every opportunity to share Okinawa's rich history and culture with as wide an audience as possible in order to more easily enable discussion about Okinawa. The Okinawa Prefectural government strongly believes in the importance of dialogue and cultural exchange across borders and around the world. I believe that tonight's discussion will contribute to the free flow of ideas around the world. I sincerely hope that everyone here can learn more about Okinawa and about the fascinating history of the Okinawan diaspora. Okinawa is justly proud of the role it has played throughout history as a bridge between the nations and regions of the world, and the journeys of those Okinawans who emigrated overseas is a part of that story. I know that many of those in the audience tonight are themselves of Okinawan descent. We are gratified that you have joined us. This webinar follows our recent discussion of trends in Okinawa studies. Whether you are a scholar or not, we hope that tonight's seminar will also contribute to sharing knowledge about Okinawa. Okinawa diaspora is a broad topic due to its long, complex history and community worldwide. Our intent with offering this webinar is to participate in a dialogue, bringing together those who are new to Okinawan studies and those already immersed in the topic of diaspora, and learn about emerging patterns and trends, new ways of approaching diasporic studies, and current issues, dilemmas, and successes. While there is a limited scholarly literature on the topic relative to other disciplines, there is a wide life experience, memory, and engagement within it. We are honored to have with us tonight two speakers with deep knowledge of the Okinawan diaspora. Both will speak on Okinawan diaspora studies. They will each introduce their own particular interests and research within this field. Dr. Luck, would you be so kind as to introduce the panelists?
Thank you, Nakasato-san. I am pleased to introduce our panelists today. And of course, I'll allow each of them in turn to explain their academic background and research focus, but allow me to give them a brief introduction. And I'm going to need to read because they are so accomplished and the breadth and the depth of their scholarship is far and wide. Dr. Taku Suzuki is a professor of international studies at Denison University. He teaches courses in introductory international studies, themes and approaches to international studies, migration and health, diversity and globalization of Japanese society, citizenship and rights of non-citizens, and memory in society. He is affiliated with the East Asian Studies and Global Health programs. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in International Studies from Meiji Gakuin University in Yokohama, Japan, and a MA and a PhD in Sociocultural Anthropology from the University of Minnesota. He has conducted field research in Bolivia, Japan, specifically Okinawa, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and Central Ohio. He authored Embodying Belonging, Racializing Okinawan Diaspora in Bolivia and Japan, University of Hawaii Press in 2010, as well as numerous other journal articles and book chapters. His research interest includes peace activism and tourism in Okinawa and the politics of collective memory among the post-World War II Okinawan and Japanese repatriates from the colonial Micronesian territories, among other topics. Dr. Ronald Nakasone is a Buddhist cleric and a professor of Buddhist studies at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. He earned his MA from Ryokoku University in Kyoto and his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research interests include Buddhist studies in ethics, spirituality and aging, and Okinawan religion. Reverend Nakasone's comments on such issues as cloning, organ transplants, euthanasia, and other more modern dilemmas in religiously and culturally diverse healthcare systems. He is the author of numerous books on Buddhism and calligraphy. So please join me in giving both of these scholars a warm welcome. Professor Suzuki, let's start with you. Please tell us about your academic background, your current research, and your thoughts on today's topic of Okinawan diaspora.
Thank you very much, Dr. Luck, and thank you everyone for being with us. And I'm also just honored to be sharing a session with Dr. Nakasone, whose seminar work, Okinawan Diaspora, and that continues to be the defining reference point for those who are interested in diaspora in general and Okinawan diaspora in particular. So as Dr. Luck introduced, I am an anthropologist, originally from mainland Japan, Yokohama specifically, but pursued anthropology in the United States. And my general interest in the broadest way I can describe is transnational migration and how race, nation, and other social identities intersect through the mobility. So I would like to provide just for today a brief overview of the historical processes of Okinawan migration in two cases. First is Okinawan migration to I'm sorry, Dr. Luck. Do you want me to go ahead and move on to the presentation, or do you want Dr. Nakasone to also introduce first before moving on to actual presentations?
Go ahead and go into your presentation, and then we'll move to Dr. Nakasone.
Thank you very much. Okay, so tonight I want to talk briefly tonight in my time briefly talk about the Okinawan migration to Latin America in the 19th to 20th century, and Okinawan Latin American migration to Japan in the late 20th to 21st century. And the second the phenomena I want to talk about is the Okinawan migration to colonial Micronesian islands during the Japanese Mandate era, and their repatriation to Okinawa after the Second World War. And I briefly mentioned some of the key features of Okinawan diaspora that could offer theoretical contributions to the diaspora studies in general. I want to preface, though, that my ethnographic fieldwork as an anthropologist that I conducted on this subject are limited to those two projects, one on transnationality of Okinawan post-World War II immigrant communities in Eastern Bolivia and Okinawan Bolivian communities in Yokohama, Japan, that I conducted in late 1990s and early 2000s. So it's more than 20 years ago at this point, as well as the other project on collective memory among the Okinawan repatriates from the colonial Marianas, which I conducted about 10 years ago, 2013 to 15. I'll do my best to contextualize my own personal research findings in the broader theoretical discussions about Okinawan diaspora, but I do recognize that it comes from a field research experience that are limited in certain situations. So if you don't mind, I want to start share my screen that includes my slide presentation. So I want to start with the Okinawan migration to Latin America first. And Dr. Nakasone, I'm sure will give a more comprehensive overview of Okinawan diaspora in general. So I want to focus on two eras of Okinawan migration to Latin America. As you can tell, the Brazil, Bolivia, Peru have a large number of Okinawan migration, and it is very difficult to substantiate the actual numbers because, as you might imagine, not all those countries' governments conduct the ethnic, census based upon ethnicities. But it's suffice to say that a large percentage of Latin American so-called Nikkei, Japanese descendant communities are Okinawan descendants, especially so in Argentina, Bolivia, and Peru. So I want to start with the brief history of it. So soon after the Meiji government's restoration, annexations of Ryukyu Kingdom, or also Ryukyu disposition, as called, the Okinawans had struggled with severe poverty and high unemployment as the Japanese government imposed monocultural agricultural policy that transformed Okinawa into sugarcane plantation-reliant economy, and a heavy land tax burden on the newly created Okinawa Prefecture. So as a result, as Dr. Nakasone will surely talk about, the first group of migrants left for Hawaii in 1899, arrived in 1900 actually, and then mainland United States and Canada. Those were the primary destinations in the early decades of Okinawan migration, as well as Japanese migration in general. But it was severely curtailed from 1900s when the so-called gentleman's agreement between the United States and Japanese government on 1908 restricted curtailed the Japanese immigration to the United States, and subsequently dramatic decline in 1924 when Johnson-Reed Act, which effectively banned Asian immigration to the United States. So then the migration shifted to Latin America. So briefly, so-called pull factor to think about in the Latin American side. For Latin American countries, for Japanese and Okinawan immigrants were already had a long history of receiving contract laborers as well as African slaves prior to it. After the abolition of slavery and only modestly successful attempts at enticing European immigrants, such as Italians and Portuguese, the plantation owners in these countries turned to Asian contract labor migrants, including Okinawans. Most of these immigrants initially worked in plantation farms, such as coffee plantations in Brazil, sugarcane plantations in Peru, and rubber plantation in Bolivia, before many of them left the rural areas for urban areas. The most famous one would be Liberdade district of São Paulo, of Brazil, but also Lima, Peru, and Liberata in Bolivia. Just a few notable aspects of Okinawan migration to Brazil, Peru, and Bolivia I want to highlight. There's a tension between the Japanese mainland migrants and Okinawan immigrant communities, which, by the way, are also discussed in Okinawan Diaspora chapters. So if you want to look for that, please look at that, the volume Dr. Nakasone edited in 2002, I believe. Mainland Japanese, or typically called Naichi or Naichijin migrants, continue to stigmatize Okinawans as the other Japanese in their migratory destinations in Latin America. In response, for example, some Okinawan community members in Peru, Brazil, and Micronesia actively proclaim their Japanese nationality in public discourse, refer to themselves as Kenjin, prefectural people, or Koloniajin. Colonia means agricultural settlement, so people from agricultural settlement, and launched what's called lifestyle reform movement, which discouraged the fellow community members from speaking Okinawan language, Chinaguchi, or playing sanshin, the musical instrument. Some even turned to what will be later known as the Kachigumi or victorious group, who refused to believe Japan's surrender in 1945 and caused violence within the Nikkei community. Wartime internment is another aspect I want to highlight. Due to the pre-existing hostility toward Japanese immigrants at large, their diplomatic positions as U.S. allies, many Latin American countries, including Brazil and Peru, severely restricted Nikkei in general, Okinawan immigrants in particular, their rights from 1930s to 40s. Japanese immigration to Latin America was virtually eliminated by mid-1930s. In 1940, there was a widespread anti-Japanese riots in Lima, in Peru, which destroyed 800 Nikkei Peruvian businesses. After Pearl Harbor attack in December 1941, the Peruvian government joined the U.S. policy by freezing Nikkei Peruvian assets and sent more than 2,000 Nikkei Peruvians to internment camps in the United States. Brazil, similarly, Japanese newspapers or language schools were closed, and over 200 Japanese schools were closed, and radio equipment was seized. Hundreds of Nikkei members, including Okinawan Brazilians, were arrested or expelled from Brazil on suspicion of espionage. Approximately 10,000 Nikkei Brazilians in 1943 in Santos area were ordered to close their homes and businesses and move away from the coastal area. After the closing of the U.S. internment camps, the Peruvian government actually refused to accept the return of those interned Nikkei Peruvians, so many had no choice but returned to the war-torn Okinawa and Japan, while some stayed in the U.S. Then this is more about my research subject 20 years ago, post-World War II Okinawan migration to Latin America. Facing the total devastation and the acute food shortage after World War II, the Ryukyu government in Okinawa, which was of course under the US occupation, promoted out-migration as a potential solution to the overpopulation. Some Latin American countries like Bolivia and Paraguay were eager to introduce labor migrants to develop their flagging agricultural industry. As a result of coordinated effort among Ryukyu, Bolivian, and US governments, Colonial Okinawa farming settlement in eastern Bolivia. I wonder if I can just briefly show the map of it. So this is the Bolivia map, and this is the eastern part of Bolivia, and Okinawa, which is literally the name of the name of the village, actually, municipality in eastern Bolivia. And as a result, during the next 10 years, approximately 3,200 Okinawans migrated and settled in Santa Cruz region. As the Japanese economy underwent significant growth in the 1960s and Okinawa's reversion to Japan in 1972, Japanese and Okinawa immigration decreased dramatically. Japanese national and Okinawan prefectural governments changed its role from promoting immigration to providing care and support for migrant communities, including Colonial Okinawa. And then I'm going to just show some pictures from my fieldwork days. This is the Okinawan Association Boliviana Japonesa de Okinawa. And they are largely engaged in large-scale farm owners. And their cultural activities, including Asia dance during the festivals and the Japanese language school, etc. And those children at the time were Sunset, the third generation. I'm going to just have some snapshots of the Colonial Okinawa pictures. Then I want to briefly talk about Okinawan Bolivian and the Nikkei in general migration to Japan in the recent decades. The Okinawan Bolivians, from the 1980s, I was looking at the wrong page. From the 1980s, thousands of second and third generation Nikkei Latin Americans, including ethnic Okinawans, migrated to Japan. It's often called dekasegi, or sojourning migration. Dekasegi migration was facilitated by several key factors. Japanese economy at the time was experiencing labor shortage, especially in construction and manufacturing sectors. In response, Japanese government in 1990 revised the Immigration Control and Refugee Recognition Act, which allowed entrance of Nikkei Latin Americans and their immediate families by issuing special resident visas. Okinawan Latin Americans, which, as I mentioned, already were a large share of Nikkei Latin American communities, were no exception. For my ethnographic field research in late 1990s, I worked with the second generation Okinawan Bolivian immigrants in Yokohama, where they primarily engaged in the construction industry, specifically electrical installation. Many others I interviewed also worked in the manufacturing sectors in Kanagawa Prefecture. Nikkei Latin American population in Japan grew quickly in 1990s and early 2000, peaking around 375,000 in 2007, or close to 20% of Japan's foreign resident population at the time. Many of these migrants worked and lived in and around manufacturing towns like Toyota City, as you might guess. It's where Toyota Motor is and its subcontractors are located. Hamamatsu City in Shizuoka Prefecture, which is where Yamaha Motor and others are located, and Oizumi City in Gunma Prefecture. That's a supermarket in Oizumi. Takara, which is a very common family name in Okinawa, so I suspect that is Okinawan Brazilian migrants' business there. Recent development, I want to just briefly mention 2008 global economic crisis and subsequent sharp economic downturn had a profound impact on Nikkei Latin Americans in Japan. 2009, Japanese government launched a program that offered cash payments for Latin American Nikkeijin to leave Japan. And about 20,000 Latin American Nikkei Latin Americans took advantage of the scheme, and many others left on their own. So dramatic decline in the subsequent few years of Nikkei Latin American populations in Japan. Many of these Okinawan Latin Americans, including the Okinawan Bolivians I worked with, are what you might call circular migrants who regularly move between Latin America and Japan. They work and save money in Japan for several years and return to Latin America in hope of starting a small business, buying a farmland, or simply retiring, only to find that these were not viable prospects. Second generation who were born in Japan or migrated to Japan when they were very young and continue to shuttle between Japan and Latin America suffer from these precarious conditions. They tend to possess low levels of fluency in Japanese language and low educational attainment. That creates that lack of socioeconomic mobility both in Japan and in Latin American home countries. So those are the sort of snapshot of Latin American migration. Then I want to move on to briefly turn to my second project about Okinawan migration to colonial Micronesia. After just briefly about Micronesia, after 1898 defeat in Spanish-American War, Spain ceded Guam to the United States and sold the remaining northern islands of the Mariana Islands to Germany in 1899. Japan took over these islands in 1918 because Japan joined as British ally in World War I. Nanyo Kohatsu Kabushiki Kaisha, or South Seas Development Company, just briefly the historical and also pick a map of the location, because some of you might not be familiar with where Mariana Islands are located. So once that those islands became the mandate territory, essentially Japanese colony, many Okinawans migrated to those what they call Nanyo Gunto, or southern islands, recruited by this NKK, or Nanyo Kohatsu Kabushiki Kaisha. That the Japanese government, NKK is a Japanese government-backed developer of Marianas, recruited Okinawans, and who had struggled with severe poverty, as I mentioned, after Ryukyu annexation. And they migrated to those islands as labor migrants. Japanese population of the Marianas, about 60% of them were Okinawans, exploded in 1930s. In 1935, more than 19,000 Japanese lived in Saipan, as opposed to some 3,500 indigenous islanders and some 200 Korean migrants. The majority of Okinawans worked as farm laborers in NKK's sugar plantations. I'm showing some pictures of that. And a tuna fisherman and a manual or clerical workers for the colonial government or small retail business owners. Here, as in the pre-World War II Latin America, Okinawans were often seen as the other Japanese by the Japanese mainlanders, many of whom were in the higher management position of NKK and Japanese colonial administrations. Escaping from the economic destitution in Okinawa, however, migrants appreciated their little economic stability in colonial Marianas, even if they suffered from back-breaking farm labor and NKK's exploitative labor practices. During my interviews with the Okinawan repatriates, they emphasized their parents' long working hours and taxing physical farm labor, but they were quick to add that it was worthwhile because their lives were improving. They remembered that their parents had told them that, unlike their counterparts living in Okinawa, they were lucky to be able to ride bikes to school, wear leather shoes, and most importantly, never go hungry, thanks to abundant fruits, livestock, fish, and Japanese food items available at NKK-owned general stores, where they could purchase daily necessities on credit. For the Okinawan migrants there, therefore, Micronesia, unlike Okinawa, provided economic security and stability, even if those were made possible by an exploitative colonial system. During the Battle of Saipan in 1944, 44,000 Japanese soldiers, 10,000 Japanese civilians, more than half of whom were Okinawans, and estimated 1,000 Koreans and indigenous islands combined were killed. Many Okinawans died not only from the relentless shelling by the U.S. fleets, but also from group suicides. Not unlike the Okinawan Battle of Okinawa, the end of Battle of Okinawa, that had many of those tragedies. Through the militaristic school education that emphasized the unconditional loyalty to the emperor, many Okinawan colonists had come to believe that it was shameful to surrender to the enemy, and that had they been captured by the Americans, all men would be enslaved, tortured, and killed, and all women would be gang raped by the captors. Survivors who had been captured by the Americans were interned in the displaced persons camps on the islands and eventually repatriated to Okinawa in 1946. Approximately 33,000 Okinawans were sent back to Okinawa, and when the repatriates were sent to Okinawa, their homeland had just undergone its own devastating war in the spring of 1945, which killed about a quarter of the local population and decimated the prefecture's social infrastructure. For those who were born and or raised in colonial Marianas and who had just lost hard-earned economic stability there, migrating to the war-torn Okinawa to restart their lives, on top of overcoming the trauma of war and loss of family members in the islands, was a daunting prospect. In fact, a majority of Okinawans wished to remain in the Marianas and petitioned the U.S. military government to allow them to resettle in Marianas after the war, but plan never materialized. These Okinawans who were born and raised in Mariana Islands but were repatriated to Okinawa after the war became what you might call internal strangers in post-war Okinawa. Those with no next of kin in Okinawa, or those whose family estates had been expropriated by the U.S. military, had to spend months in temporary accommodation. For some, their hometowns in Okinawa were taken over by the U.S. military to build an airbase. The U.S. military government of Okinawa, which needed a large number of laborers to build and operate the fast expanding military bases, became a major employers of those repatriates, such as from former colonies, such as Micronesia. The repatriates from the Marianas, who had already worked under the Americans while they were in the civilian camps in Saipan and Tinian before repatriation, found the military work in Okinawa with relative ease, but they did not enjoy it at all. Okinawan military workers were not only profoundly ambivalent about their role in helping the foreign military occupy their homeland, they were also resentful of what they perceived as American racism, such as the wage gap between American and Okinawan employees. The Okinawan repatriates in other words, struggled to restart their lives in their homeland, I guess, quote unquote homeland, and find for their true home in Mariana Islands, where they used to enjoy economic security and stability. Repatriates from Micronesia also felt ostracized by the local Okinawans. Nanyo-gairi, or returnees from South Sea, were looked on with suspicion and pity. For example, as the repatriates grew up learning the standardized Japanese language in school and used it in a multi-ethnic colonial society, they had a difficulty understanding the local municipal dialects spoken by the local Okinawan residents. Many were bullied by their classmates at the local Okinawan schools because they could not speak the local dialect accurately. Economically and socially marginalized in Okinawan society, the repatriates longed for their home in the Western Pacific. In this context, hundreds of Okinawan repatriates reconnected and formed Micronesian Repatriates Association, or MRA, in February 1948. Unsuccessfully campaigned for the U.S. military government of Okinawa to permit them to re-migrate to the Northern Marianas. Failing to achieve the re-migration, in 1963, MRA began to organize pilgrimages to the Marianas and other Micronesian islands. In its peak years, a group of more than 1,000 Okinawans traveled together to the Northern Mariana Islands on an MRA-organized trip, and more than 6,000 Okinawans have joined the pilgrimages over the years. During each MRA trip, the official ceremony is held at the northern edge of Saipan, where the Okinawan civilians retreated and died during a battle by committing suicide, as I mentioned earlier. The ceremony in front of the Okinawa Memorial Marker included all participants singing Japanese folk song to a harmonica played by repatriates from Saipan. As pilgrims sang together, many were overcome by emotion and cried. The pilgrims, many of whom did not other participants before the trip, got to know each other during the trip and often formed an intimate bond, especially when they traveled together to their childhood homes and neighborhoods, or the places of their family members' deaths. In short, those interactions and conversations led to pilgrims to share their childhood memories of colonial Marianas and how the pilgrims had survived the war, ending with an exchange of condolences to each other's losses. Through these ritualistic pilgrimages, the Okinawan repatriates from the colonial Micronesia have formed a collective memory and identity as a diasporic community. So just a few pictures from my participation in this commemorative trips to Mariana Islands. So let me finish by just giving a few potential sort of key features that might contribute to the diaspora studies. First, I want to emphasize that the Japanese state's important role in promoting and shaping migration and engaging the immigrant communities abroad. Japanese state used outmigration as a population control and economic development strategy, a means to expand the sphere of influence of the budding empire, and as a tactic to suppress potential social unrest in Okinawa and Japan at large. Second, the profound influence of the U.S. on Latin America and the Western Pacific before and after World War II, which shaped the fates of Okinawan migrations. While the Okinawan migrations to Latin America and colonial Micronesia and their migration or quote-unquote return to Japan and Okinawa were not technically forced ones, the structural discrimination and inequality vis-a-vis Japanese and U.S. governments shaped their destinies. Finally, there were robust interregional and even intercontinental Okinawan migrations throughout their history, between North and South Americas, within Latin America, and Western Pacific Islands. As such, the history of the Okinawan diaspora that spans across multiple nation-states and continents exemplifies the often unexpected complexity and entanglement transnational migration has brought to the modern world. Thank you very much. I'll stop here and pass on to Dr. Nakasone.
Okay, thank you, Professor Suzuki. It was a detailed summarization of Okinawan migration. I put this together, this book from my personal interest, actually, because my family was in Davao, Mindanao, and we migrated to Hawaii and the continental USA. And let's see, and my members of my family also migrated to the mainland Japan. And so this is a book that's very personal to me. And I should say that I had to reread this book 20 years ago. I usually don't like to reread what I wrote because so many mistakes come surface. And I noticed that I noticed this in rereading the book, especially that chapter on impossible possibility. And the Okinawans, of course, migrated to the four corners of the world, even in Africa. But I couldn't find a Japanese Kenjinkai in Chile when I visited 5 or 6 years ago. I knew they were there because when I was asked to judge an art show, they sent me slides of participants and a name of Oshiro surfaced. But Professor Suzuki spoke about the Okinawan diaspora more than for Okinawan diaspora, but the Okinawans were traveling prior to 1900s to mainly to Southeast Asia to trade. They call that when those countries, the countries below the winds, that is the monsoon season. And the monsoons determine the Okinawan trade and calendar. For example, in Ayutthaya, the old capital before Bangkok in Thailand, there was an Okinawan settlement there. That when the ships came from the north, came down to Ayutthaya, they stayed there for 6 months. And when the winds shifted, they left for home. But that's how, by the way, that's how we got the aomori from Thailand. So we greatly indebted to the Thai people for introducing aomori to the Japanese culture. But the last time I was there in Ayutthaya, and the Japanese, there's a place called the Japanese Village. And at that place, they had embraced Okinawan culture. And at that time, of course, there were separate countries. Now, when Satsuma invaded Okinawa in 1609, many Okinawans were stranded in Canton, China, and when the Japanese invaded Okinawa in 1879, many Okinawans chose to stay in Canton, 40,000 of them. And I'm glad that Professor Suzuki, spoke about my Northern Marijuana Island. And when I visited Northern Marijuana Island, there were many traces of Japanese culture and Okinawan culture there. They had incorporated into their Chamorro culture. The reason I went to Rota and Saipan and Guam is because my brother was teaching Japanese in a tiny island of Rota. And of course, my immediate family went to Hawaii. Two branches of the Nakasone family went to Hawaii. And the two branches or three branches, depends on how you count it, went to here in North America, and they landed in Mexico and walked their way up as wetbacks, as laborers. And they're still here now. I have too big a family. As far as I'm a teacher of Buddhism, and as I'm more interested in the spiritual culture of Okinawa. And when my mother passed away, the later half of the 20th century, I thought I should go back with its custom to report her death and other happenings. So I took my daughter and my mother-in-law back to Okinawa, and we visited the northern region, Yambaro, Nakijing, to go to the ancestral grave. My mother is from southern Okinawa, and they have different burial customs and beliefs. And I try to participate in the Okinawan major pilgrimages which the Okinawans had. So my current research is I'm thinking of compiling all my essays on Okinawan spirituality and producing a book. So I don't know what else I can say. I'll end it here and I'll entertain some questions.
Well, thank you both, Dr. Nakasone and Dr. Suzuki. Both of your talks were fascinating, and I have so many questions to ask you. So I'm going to try to balance the discussion questions with questions from our audience as well, because several of our audience members also submitted questions ahead of time. First, I wanted to start with, both of you talked about the Uchinanchu community worldwide and diasporic flows and circular migration. Can either of you talk about current trends that you see in diaspora, what changes you see, whether it's migration or within diasporic communities, and changes in Okinawan or Uchinanchu identity? And this could be trends, this could be things that you're hearing anecdotally, but just what do you see right now since you've published your research?
I'll defer to Suzuki Sensei.
Yes, I'll do my best. Yes, as I said, my research was a little while ago, so it's a little bit dated already. But that what I find interesting about Okinawan communities, both in colonial Marianas as well as the Latin American, including Bolivia, some of those communities are relatively new in terms of history, post-World War II migration communities. Very so deep engagement by the Okinawan Prefectural government, which happens to be a part of this session as well. That when I was there in conducting fieldwork, and I'm quite sure it continues to be the case today, the Okinawan Prefectural governments send, for example, elementary school teachers who teach at Okinawa Prefecture to stay in this Okinawan immigrant community, Colonial Okinawa, in Bolivia every 2 years, and continue to teach. Nominally it's for the Japanese language education, but reality is that they are tasked with sort of transmitting Okinawan cultural practice, such as dancing to sanshin practice, music, to even sometimes the Uchinaguchi, the Okinawan language lessons, and other cultural practice too. So I would, that what I found to be the important aspect of that of the Okinawan diaspora conversation, and frankly, diaspora discussion in general, is that in order for the diasporic connections and identity to exist, the institutional backing is to be quite important. We can talk about the imagination and the connections as a key aspect of it, our memory and remembrance, but it is very difficult to maintain some tangible collective identity after generations. And to me, that the continuation of the institutional support from in this case, Okinawa Prefecture, the homeland, seems to be indispensable part of the maintaining the collective identity as a diasporic community.
Okay. I forgot to mention that my book is heavily Buddhist. The theme of memory and the imagination is really a Buddhist concept. So I just put it out there.
Yes, Dr. Nakasone, along those lines, I wanted to come back to imagination and memory and your book, which I know you had to reread, but you talk about impossible possibility, which is a reference to Kenzaburo Oe, memory and imagination, as well as a double minority status within double diasporas. And Dr. Suzuki talked about circular migration and diasporas, this constant flux of migration. I wanted to know if either of you could talk about that in maybe a little bit more detail, although I think both of you did a really great job of explaining it already. I'm thinking in particular, I'm thinking about Anne Chang and her works, the Melancholy of Race, where she talks about racial minorities and melancholia. And her central question in her work is, how does an individual go from being a subject of grief to being a subject of grievance? And in what political and psychical gains or losses transpire in that process? So I'm thinking about racial melancholia, displacement, what is the concept of home and identity? And Professor Nakasone, in your case, how can Buddhist studies inform that process and transformation?
You got me. But I should say, taking out from Suzuki's comments, that I noticed that the Japanese government, the central government, and the Okinawan Prefectural government, the Okinawan Prefectural government is acting like its own nation. And that is why the Japanese government has my view is that all the actions that the Japanese government is taking to give Okinawan, for example, the Shuri restoration, castle restoration, is kind of guilt money, I think. And I grew up in Hawaii, and there's a big Okinawan community there. And I have to be thankful for my parents to shield me from the discrimination that they suffered. And when I was in high school, I noticed that looking back, all my friends were Okinawans, ethnicity. And now when I hear an Okinawan name, I always ask where are they from, because we may be related. Last time I had an exhibition in Dayton, Ohio, at the Art Institute, the Dayton Art Institute. And when I spoke with the Kaicho for the Kenjinkai, she was a woman, by the way. And I didn't talk too long to her, but I think we're related. She revealed enough of her history that I could figure out where she's from and how we might be related.
I want to, yes, just briefly interject on this one. So the first thing I thought about, this sort of what you might call double minority status, as Dr. Luck mentioned about this already a very small immigrant community in destination, and Okinawan as stigmatized, oftentimes stigmatized minority within it. What I found really interesting in both my research sites in colonial Okinawa in Bolivia and repatriates community from Micronesia in Okinawa was that how sort of like, I guess, the dynamics, what you might say, power dynamics within the migratory destination plays a role in shaping their self-identification. Just thought a few interesting, some even funny anecdotes I can thought of. What I thought of was the many Okinawan Bolivians I met when they when moved to Japan, as I mentioned in the presentation, to work as labor migrants. They were surprised that what they thought would be a quote unquote normal Japanese language they grew up learning in colonial Okinawa, the mainland Japanese didn't understand. And what? Japanese in mainland don't understand Japanese? And it turned out that in colonial Okinawa, the standard language was Uchinaguchi, the Okinawan language, because it's a fairly isolated immigrant community with very little interference from Japanese government. After all, the colonial was established when Okinawa was under the US rule, not the Japanese government rule. And there was very little, if at all, Japanese mainland migrants present in the community. So they never really questioned their Japanese-ness, if you will. And freely also spoke Okinawan, Uchinaguchi in the community. So hence their surprise of when they actually visited the mainland Japan as a labor migrants, it turned out what they always had thought to be the normal, quote unquote, standard Japanese was not standard Japanese or Tokyo dialect, but Okinawan language. So that's one episode. The other episode I thought about is that, Peru, especially in certain parts of Peru, and the Okinawan community is much more influential than mainland Japanese Peruvian community. So when you say, comida japonesa, Japanese food in Peru, many of them are actually Okinawan dishes, whether it's satandagi, that the donut, or Okinawa noodle, Okinawa soba, etc. They were called comida japonesa, Japanese food, even though they are very distinctly Okinawan food. And that's definitely one thought about that the context of migratory destination shapes their sort of both cultural and collective sense of belonging, that whether it's Okinawan or Japanese. So in those contexts, they probably did not necessarily think of themselves, at least in day-to-day life, as a double minorities, and the minority of minority, because as far as they were concerned, they were quote unquote authentic Japanese in the community they lived in.
I should mention that one branch of my family migrated to Peru. So this book is a very personal for me. I wanted to know the Okinawan experience in all these places. My brother, on the other hand, is went to do the marijuana to teach Japanese. He's younger than me. I just put it out there.
Well, thank you both for answering this question. I have more questions that I developed to advance the discussion, but honestly, I think I'd rather turn it over to the audience with our remaining time because they're asking some very complex and interesting questions. We have a few questions about the Okinawan diasporic community in the world, and settler colonialism. So I've had a couple of questions, and if this might be a little bit difficult to answer depending on your recent scholarship, but how can our consciousness around our indigeneity help us be more in solidarity with other indigenous people here on the Turtle Island and across the world, such as occupied Palestine? What are some examples of Okinawan Palestinian solidarity? And then I have another question saying, thank you for your talks. Can you discuss Okinawan settler colonialism in places like Hawaii and Peru? For example, how do politicians like Ige and Augusto Miyashiro, in relation to this person, he said, join anti-indigenous and right-wing political and military forces under the US military and government like Fujimori? He says, as indigenous in Shinanchu, we must stand with all occupied and colonized peoples, such as Native Americans, Kanaka Maoli, and Palestinians. So I will let either of you respond to those three questions, which are kind of in the same vein.
Well, I should mention that Okinawans are even-tempered people. They don't have a chip on their shoulder. So although they won't join the revolution, I don't think. Although at the Uchinanchu Taikai 2 years the previous one, I saw an Okinawan, he was by himself. And he was carrying a banner that said, Okinawa Ryuku Minzoku Tokuritsu, freedom to the Okinawan people. So that's my comment.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I'm not entirely sure I'm qualified to address that in a sophisticated manner, but let me at least take a stab at it. So one of the things I did think about, when I was conducting field research in both in Bolivia and Okinawa, among the colonial repatriates from Northern Marianas, was that whether I could see some connections or continuity even from that they are marginalized, colonized status in Okinawa under the Imperial Japan to post-war U.S. rule to the continuing neo-colonial conditions that Okinawa continues to be situated in, to their migratory experiences and their relationship with the local population in their respective destinations, as well as colonial repatriates case, that whether their sort of attitudes toward the U.S. military-based presence in Okinawa. If I were to stick to my observations and the sort of conversation I had with them, I didn't quite I wasn't able to substantiate that clear continuity. For instance, the Bolivia's case, as I showed in the slides, many of them were settled there as farm owners, large-scale farm owners, and many of them employ the local non-Japanese population as farm workers. And there's a class hierarchy rather clearly present in the relationship. And of course, individually they may express their sympathy for them and compassion for them, and such. So I'm not trying to paint a picture of this, the oppressive relationship between the farm owners and employees. But I wasn't able to find any sort of a connection that they make between their status as migrants from the exploited condition back in Okinawa to their migratory destination in Bolivia, turning into the large-scale farm owners who employ local, populations in low wages. That was not the connection they made. Similarly, when I talk to the colonial repatriates from Marianas in Okinawa, Some are very active in anti-US based struggle, and especially those who lived near the bases, Kadena or Futenma, those areas. But others were utterly indifferent, and it's really difficult to say that whether their experiences as from sort of migrants from a diaspora from colonial conditions and their homelands being continuing to be under neocolonial conditions influence their views of those indigeneity and anti-colonial struggle. I would love to make that sort of extrapolation, but I guess that's where my limitation as an ethnographer, anthropologist comes in. I don't feel very comfortable with extrapolating what I observed, what I heard from those people to make the case one way or the other. That's not my place, in my view, to say that. So that's where I have to limit my sort of input in this question.
I want to say that my family in Davao, Mindanao, raised hemp. And when I see the pictures, there was a clear gap between the Okinawans and the native people, whether they will take up arms and with the native people. And I can't say, but my uncle was saying he wore a sidearm gun when he went into the field.
Well, thank you both for answering those questions. I'm going to try to squeeze in two more that I think are important. I'm sorry, my lighting is messing up, so hopefully that's not too distracting. I'd like to ask two questions from Robert Arakaki. He asked, and I also believe he has a chapter in Dr. Nakasone's book. Have there been any studies that compared Okinawans and diaspora against Japanese and diaspora? My theory is that village clubs, Sonjinkai, played a significant role in the preservation of Okinawan identity, but among Japanese and diaspora village clubs did not play a significant role for Japanese and diaspora. What social processes or institutions helped groups in diaspora resist assimilation?
Well, the Okinawans are basically anti-Japanese. I married a Japanese woman, but basically we're anti-Japanese. And I recently had a friend here from down south, Oxnard, and her name was, she said she married into the Japanese family, the Nakasone family, and they're not Japanese. That was her comment. So the Genjinkai is one way that the Okinawans maintain their identity, and the religion, of course, is not Buddhist. It's shamanic shamanism. And I like to emphasize that because it's very important for the family. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. Yeah, I first of all, it's honored to receive a question from Dr. Rakaki. Of course, I've read his work in the past. Yeah, it is an interesting question, and indeed, it's everywhere you go. Okinawa Tenjinkai Prefectural Association is bar none the strongest, well-organized, well-attended organizations compared with other prefectural associations or the hometown associations of the migrant communities. Part of that, I think, have to do with that I guess two factors I can definitely think of that we already talked about, that this very specific out-migration context of Okinawans coming from the economic and other destitutes and the struggles under colonial occupation and the US occupation and so forth. That created a lot more sort of a stronger bond among them, and that definitely was a facilitating factor. But also, I would go back to that continuing, again, institutional support from prefectural government, which I just don't see that in really any other prefectural or municipal, for that matter, government and affiliated entities for any other prefectures. And that's why I tend to kind of focus on, again, I'm kind of a social scientist, me coming into this picture. Institutional supports is really crucial for maintaining that kind of bond, cultural transmission, as well as just maintaining a collective identity as a group. And that is definitely lacking in so many other prefectures, the migrants from other prefectures.
I want to add that in Hawaii, if you're a politician, you have to be Okinawan or have an Okinawan wife or Okinawan manager, election manager. I just leave you with that.
Okay, I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question, and this is from Mariko Middleton, who, by the way, runs a wonderful blog called Ichariba Chode. She asks, she says, "Thank you so much for all of the insightful dialogue and information. It really piqued my interest when Dr. Nakasone mentioned a possible book on Okinawan spirituality. To my knowledge, there aren't many resources related to this in English. The only one I know of is Women of the Sacred Grove, written by a non-Okinawan person. As I understand it, Okinawan spirituality, acceptance, and evolution has shifted tremendously depending on where diaspora has landed and how comfortable that culture is with spirituality." And she cites the US versus Brazil. So could you speak a little bit more about this project, and are there any ways for the diasporic communities to support you?
Well, that's a hard question. You tend to feel hard questions to trying to stump me, stump us. But I write extensively on Okinawan spirituality in the book I edited, The Asian American Religious Culture. It's a 2-volume book that I hope your library has it. And I write. My cousin just passed away, and I'm doing a service for her, and the children are, of course, sponsoring that service. But Okinawan spirituality is based on gratitude. The gratitude of your mother and father and immediate ancestors. So that's all I have to say. And gratitude is a hard virtue to cultivate.
Yeah, that's a really good question about the references, potential references. Um, I try to think of sort of Okinawan spirituality or just generally speaking, spiritual religious practices in their migratory destinations, diaspora communities, written in English. I'm drawing blank to be honest. I can think of many Japanese, and of course Okinawan scholars in Okinawa have written and about the communities abroad, migrant communities abroad, and that include the mentions on spirituality, religious practices, ancestor worship, and so forth. But I have to get back to that the questioner about that because I cannot think of um, any publication. I know a few publications about like a Utah, that's written in English, but of course that's not within the diasporic community, but back in Okinawa. So I'm afraid to say that I can't think of an English publication about religion and spirituality in overseas communities.
You went on? Represent.
Well, my grandmother on my mother's side was a Utah in Hawaii. I hear I heard all kinds of stories from outsiders about her powers.
Dr.
That's all I have to say.
Dr. Nakasone, your family history is quite fascinating and rich. We are running out of time. We did have a couple of questions about finding materials on Okinawa, those that are written by Okinawans and Indigenous writers, responsibilities of post-colonial archives, methodologies for exploring Okinawan diaspora. I think maybe this might be another webinar that perhaps Lynette Teria at the University of Hawaii Manoa and I should try to tackle some of these questions because I think they're incredibly salient. But any last remarks from Dr. Nakasone or Dr. Suzuki about exploring Okinawan diaspora topics, responsibilities, finding materials, just anything that comes to mind as we close out this session and thinking of a way forward in diasporic studies. Oh, thank you very much.
This is my I co-edited this book with 3 other people. I was given the task of writing an essay on spirituality. Okinawan spirituality. I forgot. I have to reread my essays.
Thank you for sharing that with us. I appreciate that. And thank you, Irene. Anything else? I'm sorry, as we're about to close out on the prospects of future study or anything that comes to mind?
I do. I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr. Nakasone.
Well, I was reading my book, rereading my book. There is a host of questions, even by Okama Sensei and Arakaki Sensei. There's a host of questions that need to be answered.
Yeah, I would echo Dr. Nakasone said and some of the questions raised. Many of the studies, at least those are available in English, are very much so either sort of like empirical ethnographic work like mine or other sort of mobile reports of those communities, diasporic communities. I think they have their own merits. I hope they do, because I'm yet one of those. Or highly theoretically sophisticated work that are usually based upon literary work or historical work, which is again also really important. But I think there is some disconnect in this sort of theoretical work that try to sort of tackle the issues of indigeneity, as somebody questioned, settler colonialism, and more in general, sort of political engagement or disengagement, for that matter, of Okinawan diasporic communities in both local and global matters. But they are often not, in my view, from what I could see, are really sort of grounded in sort of sociological, sort of empirical work. I want to see more of those work who are capable of tackling those issues. So neither just intellectual discussion about, written work and highly theorized but not quite grounded, nor well-grounded, researched ethnographic reports, but do not have theoretical sort of sufficient theoretical extrapolation. I think there are a lot of room in between that many future scholars should tackle. And that's something I hope other people will pursue.
All right, excellent. So in closing, I want to thank everyone for attending our webinar this evening. Our next webinar will be scheduled the last week of March on the military base issue. I also would like to extend my sincere and deep appreciation to Dr. Nakasone and Dr. Suzuki for joining us tonight and speaking on so many varied topics and questions. The Okinawa Prefectural DC Office will continue to hold events like this one in the future. And as I just mentioned, we're having one last webinar at the end of March. And please feel free to send us your comments and suggestions. As we mentioned, that this is an ongoing dialogue, our webinar series. So we want to hear from you what you want to learn more about. And we would like to continue talking about these particular topics. A special thanks to Dr. Steve Rapson and the collection assistant, Mariko Hotomura. And again, we post information about Okinawa, recent developments, event announcements, and etc. on the Okinawa Prefectural DC website. So please check it from time to time. And a recording of this webinar will be posted on there shortly. This concludes our Okinawan Diaspora webinar today, and thank you for attending.
Thank you.